Why would the country with the most to lose from a Hormuz blockade still vote no? That is the question almost everyone asks, but almost no one asked it seriously. Because if you ask it seriously, you are forced to leave the headline behind. China is the world's largest buyer of Iranian oil, a huge share of energy, passes through Hormuz. If the strait stays disrupted, China takes real pain. The factories feel it, the planners feel it, the margins feel it, the entire system feels it. So why veto? The easy answer is ideology. The lazy answer is loyalty to Iran. The real answer is much harder. China chose short-term pain because long-term dependence was more dangerous than short-term disruption. That is the whole story. And once you see it, the apparent contradiction disappears. On the 7th of April, a resolution came before the UN Security Council on paper. It sounded reasonable enough: restore freedom of transit in the Strait of Hormuz, protect a vital waterway, calm the global economy, reopen the route. The headlines took that framing and ran with it. China vetoes reopening, China protects Iran, China risks global stability. That reading works only if you treat the resolution as a neutral technical fix. It was not. The most important phrase in the text was all necessary means. That phrase changes everything, because all necessary means is not a maritime housekeeping clause. It is a legal bridge to force. It is how a transit problem becomes an enforcement problem. It is how a crisis around a choke point becomes a pathway toward military action wearing institutional legitimacy. That is why the drafting history matters so much. The original draft was too aggressive. China resisted, Russia resisted, others were uneasy. The language was softened. The most provocative pieces were cut back. The draft was diluted, and China still vetoed it. That tells you something profound. Beijing's problem was never merely the loudness of the wording. Its problem was the architecture underneath the wording. Even watered down, the draft still pointed toward the same strategic result. If the crisis escalates, the United States gains a legal route to present itself as the legitimate enforcer of order around one of the world's most important energy arteries. That is the result China feared more than the disruption itself, because from Beijing's point of view, the deeper issue is not whether Hormuz is open tomorrow. The deeper issue is whether the old order gets to prove that when the real valves of the global economy are threatened, the final manager is still Washington. That is the nightmare. The fear has been with China for years. The Malacca dilemma is the best known expression of it, but the logic is wider than Malacca itself. China's rise still depends on routes its rival can influence, protect, or choke. That means that every time the United States successfully restores order around a choke point, especially with legitimacy attached, Beijing is reminded that its industrial machine still lives inside somebody else's security architecture. That is the thing China most wants to escape. So the choice was not as simple as the headline suggested. It was not reopen the route or suffer. It was suffer disruption now, or help restore a hierarchy that may constrain you for decades. That is why Beijing chose pain. Short-term pain is survivable. Long-term dependence is not. That is the first layer of the veto. Now move to the second, because this is where the logic gets much deeper. Hormuz is not only a route for oil, it is part of the machinery of the petrodollar system that matters, because U.S. power does not rest only on ships and bases. It also rests on the fact that energy trade and dollar demand reinforce each other. Oil priced in dollars helps support the broader financial architecture of American dominance. The roots and the currency system are more connected than most people like to admit. So when Hormuz becomes unstable, the shock is not just an energy shock. It is also pressure on the system built around energy. That is where China sees strategic opportunity inside immediate danger, because Beijing has been building alternatives for years. UN settlement channels, cross-border payment rails, belt and road infrastructure, energy links with Russia and Iran. None of these matter enough in a perfectly stable system to overturn the dollar order. But that is not Beijing's goal in the short term. The goal is not immediate replacement. The goal is erosion. Every week that the old order looks less automatic is another week in which alternatives look more rational. That is why China can endure costs. Now, because Beijing is not just asking, how much does this disruption hurt us today? It is also asking, does this disruption weaken the old order we have spent years trying to dilute? That is a very different calculation. From that perspective, a quick US-led restoration is not neutral relief. It is strategic defeat. Now go to the third layer. China could make this decision because it has spent years preparing for a rougher system, strategic petroleum reserves, diversified suppliers, the China-Pakistan economic corridor, domestic build-out in solar, wind, nuclear, and reserve generation, expanded transport redundancy, overland energy cooperation. All of these are parts of the same logic. Do not become immune, become durable. That is the distinction. China is not comfortable with Hormuz instability. China thinks it can survive it better than the restoration of a U.S. legitimized chokehold hierarchy. That is what the veto tells you, and that leads directly to the fourth layer, which is legal and narrative. At the UN, China argued that the draft did not address root causes. Russia said something similar. Maybe the West dismisses that as cynical, fine, but the more important question is how the rest of the world hears it. And much of the global South hears it very differently, because many states across Asia, Africa, and Latin America already view the rules-based order with suspicion. They have seen force come first and legal explanation come later. They have seen interventions wrapped in supposedly neutral language. They have seen sovereignty treated as absolute for some states and negotiable for others. So when China says no to a resolution that still looks, even after revision, like a path toward legitimized force, Beijing does not just protect a partner. It gains narrative credit. It gets to say, we refused automatic legalization of escalation. That matters. Because narrative power is not cosmetic. It shapes which side looks stabilizing and which side looks imperial. It shapes who gets trust in a more fragmented world. And in a system moving away from automatic Western moral authority, that matters a great deal. Now we reach the largest layer. The veto was not just about Iran. It was not just about Hormuz. It was a test of whether the old order still repairs itself automatically for decades. Washington often operated as though strategic necessity could eventually be translated into institutional legitimacy. If something mattered enough to American power, the system usually found a way to ratify it, absorb it, or legalize it. That was one of the privileges of the post-Cold War era. But this time, the system did not repair itself. The United States sought legitimacy around one of the world's most important choke points. And it did not get it, not on a procedural issue, on a structural one, because China and Russia said, no, that is what makes this vote so important. It means there are now real limits on how easily Washington can turn force into legitimacy, not theoretical limits. Visible ones. This is multipolarity when it stops being a forecast and becomes a condition. And once you map the vote across the real dimensions of power, the logic becomes unmistakable. Militarily, China shaped the environment without deploying force. Economically, it accepted near-term pressure to avoid a more dangerous restoration of petrodollar-backed maritime hierarchy. Politically, it positioned itself against selective enforcement. Narratively, it gained power with states already skeptical of Western interventionary habits. That is an extraordinary amount of leverage from one veto, which is why the right question was never, why would China block a route it needs? The right question was always, why would China help restore a strategic order that keeps it dependent? Beijing refused that restoration. That is what the veto means. This was not a paradox. It was a declaration. China chose short-term pain because long-term dependence was worse. And once you understand that, the vote stops looking confusing. It starts looking inevitable. China did not choose disruption because disruption was good. China chose disruption because a US-managed solution would have been more dangerous. That is the whole point, and that is why the world saw a no vote but failed to understand the decision inside it.